Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's good to be with you all. Thank you for being here, and for those who are virtual joining us, we welcome you back. We are happy today. We have our keynote speaker, who is Father Danny Pilario, and very happy that he can be with us to enlighten us on the topic, Repair My House, Empowering a Church of the Poor through the Eyes of St. Vincent. I'm putting in a little plug of saying I'm a director of Catholic Campus Ministry, and we brought some of our student leaders here, and we're excited to have them now. Oh, there we go. So we're happy to have them with us as well, taking in the wisdom of this conference. Basically, our format will be about 40 to 45 minutes of Father Pilario giving his keynote address. Then we will have time, as we have in the past, for a small group discussion of 5 to 7 minutes or so, followed by Q&A, which we will open up for all of you as well as those who are online. So with no further ado, I will introduce our speaker. So Father Daniel Pilario. He is a member of the Congregation of the Mission in the Philippines. He serves as associate professor at the St. Vincent School of Theology at Adamson University, as well as director of research at Adamson in Quezon City, Philippines. During the 2021-22 academic year, he served at St. John University in Queens, New York, as the Vincentian Chair of Social Justice, visiting professor at St. John's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Father Pilario holds both his MA and PhD from the Catholic University of Louvain in Louvain, Belgium. He has many published works and has edited and co-edited several anthologies, which you can read more about in his biography in the packet. Father Pilario is also a past president and founding member of DeCateo, the Catholic Theological Society of the Philippines, and a professional lecturer at various Filipino universities and seminaries. On the weekends, he regularly ministers at a garbage dump site parish in the village of Payatas in Quezon City. I hope I got most of those pronunciations right. So, with no further ado, let us welcome Father Pilario.
Thank you very much, Rachelle, for the kind words of introduction. Thanks, Mimo, for inviting me into this conference, and to Bill Kavanagh from the Center of World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. When I started to prepare for this conference, I went back to an email that Bill sent me like months ago, trying to explain to me what is expected of me. And he writes this: in general, we are thinking of this conference as a way for the Vincentian community to think through what it has to offer to the church that Pope Francis envisions. We are looking for pathways to reform the church, in part by making it more outward-looking toward the transformation of the world. We don't want this to reduce, we don't want this to reduce the gospel to social justice, however. So we invite you to be resolutely theological in your keynote. That's a big word. I was trying to imagine, what will I do? What does it mean, resolutely theological? We want to reach deep into the well springs of the gospel and the Vincentian charism in order to present a compelling vision of what God is calling us today. After finishing to read that email, I thought, this is a tall order. I was even wondering, does Bill want me to write a book on this, or,
The answer is yes.
or teach in one semester the course that is expected? My modest attempt here maybe is just to barely scratch the surface of that objective. If I would be very happy if I incite, instigate, encourage you to start the discussion. So, for those who want outlines, this slide is for you. Uh, this is actually just for you to know where I am going and for me to know where to stop. This is very simple, but let me start with number one, suffering and pain in the world. I think any discussion on church reform today has to start from these locus theologies. I would like to read something. It's a description. Little girls of 8 and 10 were subjected to the most abominable outrages under the eyes of their manacled parents. After shamefully abusing their victims, these monsters, the word is not too strong, sprinkled them with gunpowder and set them on fire. The terrified villagers fled into the cities, driving their flocks and herds before them, and they thronged the streets and slept in outhouses. You must be imagining that this narrative happened in the mountains of present-day Myanmar or the hinterlands of Latin America or Asia, where violent armed groups are just terrifying and terrorizing people. No. This account comes from a French historian, Alphonse Fillet, who was describing the situation during the War of the Front in the 1640s. Another famous French historian, Michelet, wrote about these times. The history of humanity seems to have come to an end when we enter into this period. We are dealing no longer with men and nations, only with the brutality of war and its rude instrument, the soldier. An orgy of crime and unlimited license, the horrors of cities besieged, and the dreadful joys that follow a victorious assault. In all directions, we see the vanquished, the wounded, and the slain. Women passing from hand to hand, or everywhere tears and outcries. The same period. Even as Michelet has said so, we know that history did not stop and did not come to an end in his time. Violence continues until today. Here is a small narrative. There was a boy, 18 years old, taken prisoner. First, they shot through his leg with a machine gun. Then he got his ears cut off. He admitted to everything and he was shot dead. We do not take prisoners, meaning we don't leave anyone alive. This is Leonia speaking, a Russian soldier who found his mother recently in the middle of the Ukraine war front, telling his mother about what they were doing. And we know that as we sit here, thousands, maybe millions, suffer in the hands of soldiers who I know ironically have a sworn duty to protect their people. I come from the Philippines. I teach on weekdays in university, but on weekends, Saturday and Sunday, I work in the garbage dump parish in Manila, the greatest garbage dump in Manila. And you can just imagine all the kinds of problems that a garbage dump in a third world country like ours generate. Hunger and poverty, homelessness and disease, name it, you have it. But in the last 6 years, we have encountered a very difficult problem we were not prepared to handle. It's called extrajudicial killings. The president of the Philippines in the last 6 years wanted to create a drug-free Philippines. And in order to implement that, he asked his policemen to go into those houses and kill the drug addicts and the drug peddlers, small drug peddlers that they can find in their drug list. This picture was taken during the funeral of Juan. Juan went home to his family. He knew he was in the drug list. He went home to his family because it's a birthday of one of his children. He cooked spaghetti, and while he was feeding his children, the police barged in and shot him. One of those little girls saw what they did to his father, to her father. Juan is just one of the 30,000 killed by the Duterte regime, which landed him in a crime against humanity at the International Criminal Court. You can just imagine the suffering of the families that this program has left. My narrative is just one violence among many. Some overt and brutal, others covert and gradual. Here is a description by John Sobrino, a Latin American theologian, that captures the whole thing. And he said, millions of human beings continue to suffer massively, unjustly and innocently in repressions, wars, and massacres. Many millions more suffer a slow death from poverty, particularly women and children, besides the death of their dignity and their cultures. Most of these deaths have definite causes, either active when they are inflicted by institutions and authorities, like the ones I mentioned, or passive when many of these tragedies are not prevented, even though they could have been. For me, this is an apt description of the concrete consequences of what Pope Francis calls the global economy that kills. To name the elephant in the room, which Michael wanted us to do this morning, global capitalism. Looks like suffering is structured. But if you come to think of it, suffering is actually personal. I'll give you 1 or 2 minutes, and you can just see the faces of your friends and families who are suffering at this moment. While I was taking the plane coming here from Manila, it's strange that in the whole 20-hour flight, I could not sleep. And what actually preoccupied my mind was suffering, pain. There was only one prayer. All throughout, I was just saying, Lord, why? Why so much suffering? Comes to mind, for instance, is my nephew who just met during the Holy Week. Intelligent guy, but suffering from mental health issues. And you could imagine what that means to a poor family like ours. Or a young boy who is an orphan of that war, whom we just discovered before I left for the airport. He contracted HIV. Why? At this time, as of St. Vincent's, the basic question is this: what is the fundamental Christian response in the face of suffering? Any viable church reform, be it in its administrative structures and pastoral ministries, in its liturgies or theologies, can only start from the recognition of and a response to suffering. In the following minutes, I would like to explore 3 hermeneutical keys in Pope Francis' papacy and reform: mercy, mission, and synodality. It's quite difficult to read Pope Francis with all that he has written and said. my suggested little suggestion is to look at him from the lens of these three windows, what I call hermeneutical keys, in order to understand his voluminous theological work. From there, I will look for some intuitions in St. Vincent's spirituality and mission, hoping to find some inspiration as our Vincentian contribution in the present reform. Let's start with mercy. The homilies and speeches of Pope Francis are replete with words of mercy. These three are just examples. A little bit of mercy can make the world less cold and more just. You go through Google and you will find the rest. I was asking myself, what gives unity to these statements that merely appear like quotable quotes or hashtags in Facebook? To be honest, mercy did not have good press in modern popular consciousness. On the one hand, it is seen as mere sentimental feeling, affective but not effective. It's just mercy. On the other hand, mercy also is reduced to acts of charity, quite active, effective, but lacking in affect. So which one is which? But beyond this binary, let us explore the theological vision that underlies Pope Francis' discourse. And let me give these three. First, for Pope Francis, mercy is the definition of God. He once published a book entitled The Name of God is Mercy. To quote John Sobrino, he said, "In the beginning was mercy." If the Gospel of John tells us that in the beginning was the Word, that Word concretely shows itself in mercy. This God reveals God's self as one who responds in mercy to pain and suffering in the world. In Exodus, for instance, God said, "I have seen and witnessed the affliction of my people. I have heard their cry." And so he told Moses, "Go, liberate them." In the New Testament, mercy is the visceral love of God, to quote Pope Francis. Visceral love, a feeling that comes from one's internal organs, from the mother's womb, for instance, or from one's guts. His guts went out to pain and suffering when he saw the crowd who were like sheep without a shepherd. It's that way. Or when he confronted the pain of the widow of Nain who lost her son. The God of mercy takes on a face, and his name is Jesus. Second, if mercy defines God, it should also define our humanity. That is why the story of the Good Samaritan is crucial to the theological project of Pope Francis. Pope Francis does not allow ambiguity. You listen to this in Fratelli Tutti, but also in Evangelii Gaudium. There are only two kinds of people. You are either the priest or the Levite or the Good Samaritan. Because fence-sitting and neutrality is not a Christian option. The fence-sitters, well, he said, he has a little bit of commentary. He said, actually, the priest and Levite who passed by are actually religious people. And many of them are here. He says, fence-sitters are actually allies of the robbers. There is no other option. In my fight against the victimization of the victims of war and drugs, my family, I have 10 brothers and sisters. It's not a big family, just 11 of us. They would always send me a message and they will tell me, can you stop talking? And they said, and they have reasons, because many of those who were vocal about it were either in prison or got killed. And they are afraid that I am the next one. But when I go home, I ask myself, what meaning would my priesthood be if I do not speak and take sides? How can a Eucharist be meaningful when in the small chapel where you celebrate, next 20 meters, someone is just killed, and I do not say anything about it? Can I be a fence sitter? What meaning would my priesthood have if I don't take sides? But even if I'm not a priest, what meaning would my humanity have in the midst of that violence? Third is, mercy and compassion also defines the nature of the church. If we speak of internal reform of the church in our times, which we have been discussing all throughout the day, that reform must start from outside, not inside. From the streets, from the peripheries where people cry in pain, or better still, where the poor no longer have the voice to cry at all. The criteria of reform is beyond administrative, managerial, or sociological, even as these dimensions are necessary. It should be an answer to whether this church of ours still responds in mercy to the millions that suffer in our midst. In short, the church must be merciful as the Father is merciful. It must be compassionate as the Father is compassionate, as we find in Luke 6:36. The American theologian Marcus Borg offers a good lens to read this crucial biblical text. He argues that our following of God, imitatio Dei, shifted from the politics of purity and perfection to the politics of mercy and compassion. The injunction to be compassionate as our Heavenly Father is compassionate has superseded the Matthean axiom, be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect. Compassion and mercy, not holiness and perfection, is the dominant quality of God, and therefore the ethos of the community that mirrors God. Or better still, maybe holiness and perfection are defined by the quality of our mercy and compassion. So how do we locate Saint Vincent in all these reflections? Like Pope Francis for Vincent, mercy is at the heart of our Vincentian charism. Mercy is the distinctive feature of God. For sure, Vincent's Christology is still the high Christology of his times, like God coming down from heaven, or the incarnation. But the idea of the incarnation is actually twisted by Vincent to say that actually mercy is the motive of the incarnation, the reason for the incarnation. And he said, how tender the Son of God was. This tender love was the cause of his coming down from heaven. And he saw men deprived of his glory. He was touched by their misfortunes. Mercy is the reason for the incarnation. Many of the authors that we are reading on Vincentian spirituality tells us that Vincent's Christ is in fact the Lucan Christ, and Luke is in fact the gospel of mercy. And Vincent de Paul goes down in history with these texts. You have read this in many posters. The poor people who don't know where to go and what to do, they're suffering and their numbers increase every day. They are my burden and my sorrow. This text tells us that Vincent realizes that if Jesus becomes the servant, God has become a servant, we too should become the servant ourselves. So that the poor, the homeless, the sick become our lords and masters. Vincent was not original in this. Such inversion happens already in Matthew 25. That's my point. I think that it is only from this context that we can understand the Marian Vincentian apostolates worldwide and the structure of our communities. In Vincentian spirituality, religious practices, therefore, should proceed from and lead us to the love of God in the person of the poor. So much so, and this is the famous phrase, we can leave God for God. Or that, I don't know if you have heard this, we can in fact sell our chalices, maybe including the chandeliers and the tiles in those churches, to answer for the needs of the sick. Or our liturgies should not be so long that they will steal the time that we do to serve the poor. That is why he doesn't want us to chant. Some Vincentians continue chanting anyway. Our habits should be like those of the poor, so that they would not be ashamed to be with us. That is why he does not want the sisters to experiment the habits and later on. But when he died, later on, they experimented with something flying. That was after St. Vincent. Our community life, our structures should also lead us and not hinder us from the mission. And lastly, I think this is the end all. Religious vows, which for many in the medieval religious life are the end all and be all of one's consecrated life, were decentered by Vincent and recasted towards compassionate service. So much so, the Daughters of Charity has to renew that vow every year. Or the Vincentians in the beginning did not have that vow at all. That was not the be all and end all of our existence. Now, going to today. It is from this theological paradigm of mercy that we can recover an old theological category called corporal and spiritual works of mercy, which Pope Francis wants us to do. And this is supposed to be the specialization of the Vincentian family, corporal works of mercy. From SSBP to Ladies of Charity to Daughters of Charity and the Vincentians here. These terms, corporal works of mercy, fell into disgrace because of its dualistic language, product as it is of an old, outdated theology. But I am thinking, in our violent times where victims meet us at the doorstep, refugees, victims of calamities, wars, the sick and the hungry during the pandemic, corporal works of mercy actually becomes revolutionary. The first thing the victims need is water and food, medicine, blankets and clothes to keep them warm, roofs to cover their heads, some place to bury their dead. Many look down on them as dole-outs or handouts, the sister said. And some progressive liberation theologians criticize them as helping legitimize the status quo. But from the context where I come, to feed the widows and orphans is a subversive act, because I can be church with cuddling communists. Or to bury the dead or protect the victim becomes a subversive act against a government that wants to exterminate them. Moreover, to rethink corporal works of mercy becomes prophetic in times of globalization. For instance, feeding the hungry means ensuring access to food sustainability when multinational companies dictate on the prices of basic commodities. Giving drink to the thirsty means preventing the incursion of powerful mining companies into our watersheds that provide water to our communities. And Laudato says water is a universal human right, which is denied because of multinational mining companies encroaching into ancestral lands in the third world. Clothing the naked or sheltering the homeless means working for land acquisition or sustainable housing program, which governments prefer to allocate to big business. And comforting the sick and burying the dead means fighting for viable health care for all citizens and making medicine accessible to all against the hegemony of big medical companies. Visiting the prisoner can also mean working for a more just and legal judicial systems that send the innocent into prison or just merely kill them. Mike challenges us earlier to name the elephant in the room, but we can be resistant to capitalist incursion by even rethinking the corporal works of mercy. To end, mercy is not a sentimental feeling. It is first of all the nature of God. And like Jesus, preferential option for the vulnerable and the suffering can be a subversive act. Which brings me to my second point. Mission. The second hermeneutic key in Pope Francis' reform is mission. Mission is our deepest identity. It is who we are. In the beginning of Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis was saying, I dream of a missionary option. And in the end of Evangelii Gaudium, that's the beginning, first numbers. In the end of Evangelii Gaudium, it's the same thing. I am a mission. Didn't say I have a mission. I am a mission. And without this mission, I'm dead. Well, he didn't say that, I'm just imagining, but it's more or less like that. At the risk of generalization, we can summarize the message of Evangelii Gaudium into 3 statements. First, the problem of the church today is the lack of zeal and joy, desolation and defeatism, and anguish among church workers. Second, the diagnosis, the reasons for this are self-referentiality, self-absorption, spiritual worldliness, a term which he in fact adopted from Benedict XVI and he tried to develop again. It is a kind of church unmindful of the world outside it because its main concern is to preserve itself. And the third, the antidote is actually mission, logic of encounter at the peripheries. If the problem is the logic of exclusion, the antidote is the logic of encounter, which also developed in Fratelli Tutti. Have the smell of the sheep, go to the peripheries. These are repeated many times by Pope Francis in all his speeches. Now, what does Vincent has to do with this? By definition, the Vincentian family is missionary. The mission is our identity. The CMs were called priests of the mission. It was the people who gave us that name, not we ourselves. And Vincent wanted our houses to be called houses of the mission. This defines our lives from the beginning. I think if there is anyone who believed in Pope Francis, of course, before Pope Francis was born, it was Saint Vincent. To the end of his life, he was a missionary. And this letter is a postscript to his letter to Charles Nakar, who was sent on mission to Madagascar, the most difficult that they have encountered in 1648. The old Saint Vincent wrote Nakar in his
Do you want to take this back? No, that's good.
That is Saint Vincent speaking. He said, what more can I say to you? So he's sending a young priest to Madagascar just to die, and all of them were dying. And he said, what can I say to you? There is nothing on earth I would like more than to go with you and be your companion if only I could. That tells you how mission is a characteristic of our Vincentian call. Let me give two reflections in contemporary missiology that may be close to the heart of Saint Vincent. Number one, mission as the mission of God. And number two, mission as transformative action. First, it is only in recent years that mission is conceived of as missio Dei, or the mission of God, mission of the Trinity. In previous centuries, mission is replete with images of colonial conquest, like conquering the world for Christ. You have seen that. If you want to conquer the world, join the CM or something like that. No, we don't do that. Or a soteriological project, like saving souls. Or an ecclesial expansion program, like conquering or like planting churches. Even the question on we are losing numbers belongs to that paradigm. But following some Protestant theologians, in recent years, missio is missio Dei. It is a movement of God into the world. God is a missionary God, and according to one Protestant theologian, he says, I think mission is the work of God, not of the church. There is no church because there is church because there is mission, not vice versa. To participate in mission is to participate in the movement of God's love toward his people. Now, what does it have to do with Vincent? Vincent de Paul, being a man of his times, certainly echoes the expansionist ideals of medieval missiology, to be true and honest. But interestingly enough, his discourse intimates the missio Dei framework. He never tires of repeating to his converts that Jesus is the missionary of the Father. It's Jesus. It's the Father's mission, and Jesus is God's missionary. This is where he diverges from Pierre de Béruul's Christ as the perfect adorer of the heart. There is no reason why Vincent departed from Béruul's influence, but in my little reflection, maybe it's because of the different vision in Christology. And we missionaries should do something and continue his work. Second, mission as transformative action. I have an interesting observation on the Synod of Bishops on Evangelization, 2012, still under Benedict XVI. Both an Evangelii Gaudium, the papal exhortation that follows it, done by Pope Francis. So 2013, 2012. Both actually talks about new evangelization. But there is one substantial difference in these two documents. On the one hand, the Instrumentum Laboris of the Synod on Evangelization talks about new evangelization for the transmission of the Christian faith in the spirit of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, CCC. A cursory reading of this working document does not yield any social agenda. Evangelii Gaudium is different. In Pope Francis' mind, new evangelization is not just about strategies in proclaiming the gospel. He thinks that new evangelization should proclaim the social message of the gospel. And this is precisely half of the Evangelii Gaudium. Beyond catechesis and good homily, that's also first part of Evangelii Gaudium, the gospel is first of all proclamation of the kingdom of God in the second part of Evangelii Gaudium. The point is, for Vincent, mission is our prime agenda. But he was always careful not to fall into a binary division of evangelical word. And this is what he said to prevent that. He said, if there are some among us who believe they are in the mission to evangelize the poor and not to take care of them, to remedy their spiritual and not their temporal needs, I will tell them that they have to help them and have others help them in every way, by ourselves and by others, because to do this is to evangelize the world. I think that this intuition was later elaborated in subsequent church theological documents. We call it integral evangelization, inclusive development, justice and liberation, all of them present in the social teachings of the church. To be precise, my point, if we want to take this seriously, mission in the Vincentian family today means making the Catholic social teachings as the primary site of our evangelization. And this is affirmed in the last CM General Assembly. My third point, synodality. This has been well discussed in the previous conferences. My little contribution here is this. I think the question of synodality is to inquire whether the modus operandi et vivendi of the church, this is according to the IPC document, effectively responds to the problem of suffering in the world. One bishop in Asia sent me a text message during the height of the continental meeting on synodality in Asia. And he said, he's my friend, so maybe he wanted just someone to drive his mind away from their discussions. And he asked me, Danny, if you are given one sentence to contribute to synodality, what would that be? And I answered him, Bishop, do not forget the poor. They are the least heard in our structures. I strongly feel that synodality is not merely about us, our equality, our communion, our participation. No, it is about the other, whom the church has always included. They stare us in the face and put us into question. Since this is the talk of the town now, I would not go into that, but let me go into two things on Vincent's life. What would synodality mean in the time of Vincent? I'll just summarize this. First, Vincent's refusal of power. If clericalism is the problem in the church today, Vincent has a share in it, maybe more than we do. This is a description by Jacques de Leroux, an author describing the clericalism of that time. And he said, in a flash, they passed the high clergy. They passed from the court to, or from the war or commerce to the altar. That's a good message. And they have the chalice in their hands before they have the tonsure in their heads. That was described to us last night. What does St. Vincent, what did he do on this?
Still seeing it today.
I think there are a lot of narratives on how Vincent, for instance, confronted Cardinal Richelieu and Mazarin. These are well known to us. But let me narrate a small story where Vincent obliquely resisted clerical power. The sociologist Norbert Elias wrote in a book called Court Society. And this is what he said. If power exists but is not visible in the appearance of the ruler, the people will not believe. The people must see in order to believe. And this is shown in the specific courtly etiquette, their manner of dressing, their pomp, and their pageantry, which marks the level of their hierarchical status. That's the court society. Vincent belongs to this court society, part of the Council of Conscience. But he refused this display of power. He went to the Council of Conscience with his simple cassock, and one day, I think he wore a girdle in a misplaced way. And Cardinal Mazarin wanted to make fun of him. And he said, "Look, Vincent, what a nice girdle he wears." Vincent did not reply. The traditional interpretation says that this is a sign of Vincent's humility and detachment. But beyond the act of individual virtue, Vincent's non-conventional courtly etiquette was an act of resistance to the seemingly formidable dominant power that reproduces itself in courtly bodies. In other words, his simple but self-assured presence unwittingly poses itself as a threat to others who compete for this highly contested space. If you prefer a more religious language, his simplicity of lifestyle is a prophetic challenge to power and dominance. This brings me to my second point before my last conclusion. Empowerment. If we want a synodal church, we need to empower all its sectors. Because to be a listening church only happens when the person on the pew has the capacity to speak. For to speak out is not an automatic capacity for most peoples. Some have been used to being silenced for centuries, that they think this is the right thing to do. First, in Vincent's time, if the lower clergy were neglected parts of the French church, Vincent directed all his resources to form the lower clergy that deals and takes care of the poor people. Second, if the lay people, especially the women, were neglected sectors of the church in his times, Vincent de Paul took on the confraternities, the ladies of charity, and empowered them. There is a very critical analysis Vincent had. This is a longer speech, but Vincent used to say this in front of the ladies of charity. For 800 years, he said, women have no public employment in the church. Formerly, there were called deaconesses. Vincent knew his history. Vincent accepted this. The present church could not yet accept deaconesses anyway. But about Charlemagne's time, your gender has been deprived of such ministry, and ever since it had none. But now, look at you. The rest is history. Of course, Vincent was very much a man of his times. His ecclesiology was the hierarchical Tridentine church, as his conferences would show and tell us. But beyond the dominant institutional model, there is what I call cracks in the parchment cortex, not iron cortex, parchment cortex. Beyond the dominant model, there is an intuition of communion. And let me read this. He said, "It has never been heard even of animals, that one member did not share the pain of another, that one member of one's body could be bruised, broken, and crushed, and the other member did not feel it. No, that is impossible. All members are sympathetically bound together, that the pain of one is the pain of the other." I single this text out because that can be easily transferred to Fratelli Tutti. And that is precisely what Pope Francis. These same words, the mark tells us that the mark of our humanity, and in Saint Vincent, even of the beasts, because he could not think that the beasts could do it anything, are found in our solidarity with those in pain and suffering. This is the vision of the church in community. Brings me to my last point and conclusion. Saint Bonaventure told of this story about Saint Francis of Assisi. One day, Saint Francis was walking by the country church of San Damiano and went inside to pray. Kneeling before the image of the crucified, famous cross now, Bonaventure writes, Francis heard of with his bodily ears a voice coming from the cross, telling him 3 times, Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you see, is falling to ruin. That's Francis of Assisi. So Francis took it literally. He sold everything, collected bricks, and built the church. Only to know that the Lord was actually talking about the body of Christ. The church is the body of Christ. Lepers, the sick, the vulnerable. The church of the poor. And the church of the poor is a constant call all throughout the church in the reformation of the church. However, in the vision of St. Francis, the church of the poor included animals, flowers, suns and moon, and the rest of creation. Common home is being destroyed and falling apart, as Laudato Si rightly tells us. That's the inclusiveness of Francis' reform. 400 years after Francis, Vincent de Paul heard the same call to rebuild that house. I think the 400 years is not a nice number to play with. Because St. Francis was born in 1181. St. Vincent was born in 1521. So that's precisely 400 years. And more or less, the general in the first day told us that we are entering the 400 and whatever anniversary of the calling in the congregation. So it's nice to imagine numbers, you know. But my point is this. In St. Vincent, the voice did not come directly from heaven or the crucifix, as it did in St. Francis. The voice came from a heretic, a Huguenot, during the mission in Montmirail, sometime in 1620, at the height of Vincent mission's activity. This man challenged St. Vincent, and he said, here, the pastors are ignorant and vicious, and the faithful are left without instruction. The poor country folks are lost. Don't tell me that the church is guided by the Holy Spirit. I don't believe you. That's a brave confrontation. I don't know if this is true. The historian solved that. But I think these are all written in his biography. And late, but the next year, there was a mission done in the next town, Marseille. And the heretic saw what was going on. He was so touched that he had a moment of conversion. He went back to St. Vincent and wanted to be readmitted to the church. Now, the story is not finished. On the Sunday of his readmission, he has one problem. He could not believe in those statues of stone, Mary and the saints included, which he saw in the church. You know, the usual problem. To answer him, and what caught my attention, to answer him, Vincent called a child in the congregation and made that child explain to him what this means in our faith. It was said that this convert remained a holy man to the end of his life. What is significant for me, and this is my last paragraph, what is significant for me in this narrative is that the child, the weakest, the most inarticulate, abused and neglected, the poorest of the poor in the church assembly, it was this child that enlightened him. The vulnerable child who in most recent times until today, is found at the center of church crisis because of our neglect. Ironically, became the source of enlightenment and hope. It is the empowerment of the poor that we call ourselves the Church of the Poor. It is already a happy development when the ministers of the church become and find themselves in the peripheries, help those in the margins, become the voice of the voiceless. But when this happens, we are not yet there. We could not be voice of the voiceless forever. We pray and work for the time when the poor and the vulnerable have the strength to speak boldly for themselves, when they have the courage to stand up for their rights, when they can articulate God's presence in our midst in their own theological language and not in ours. For as theologians, for the Church of the Poor is one where the poor are not only helped but empowered to become helpers, are not only evangelized but themselves become evangelizers. Thank you, and good afternoon.
Thank you, Father Pilario, for so much wisdom, helping us reflect on mercy, mission, synodality. I think for me, and I'm guessing many of you, it's one thing when you hear ideas that are profound and striking, but also to hear someone present with such passion and clearly lived experience of your care for the poor, for God's people, and for living out this mission is really inspiring to all of us, and I think what at least I strive to achieve, and all of us as well. So thank you again. We're going to go into some small group time, just 5 to 7 minutes or so. If you want to turn to a person or two who are next to you and think about, is there something in particular that struck you, moved you, challenged you? And then also you might be thinking of questions that you have for our presenter here. So we'll take just 5 to 7 minutes. And just so you're aware, because there's a lot of crowds in the back, there are some seats up here at the table up front. I won't bite up here next to me too. So we'll take 5 to 7 minutes and then come back for some Q&A time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Presentation. Thank you. So I was curious. So you said you teach Monday through Friday at Catholic University, and on Saturday and Sunday you go to this very impoverished place. Do a lot of students go with you?
Yes, in fact, that's the program of our School of Theology, that the poor can become formators of our priests and sisters to be, lay people included, but also that the professors and the students would learn from the poor. So we have this exchange, not only in these places, we also bring them to these places, but in many others. It looks like a structure of our theological learning. For instance, I teach theology of grace, and the first 3 or 4 meetings, I don't hold classes. I let them go to the streets or to the slums or to wherever, and inquire on how people talk about grace, what they think of grace. And those narratives can be brought to the classroom and made to question what you call the classics of grace. So in short, the reading of the theological text is informed and affected by the questions people have. So one time I assigned one sister, she's not a daughter of charity, but as assigned her to the recycling area where people recycle paper from waste from like that. And I told the man in charge of the recycling area, because we don't do recycling in machines, we recycle by hand. And I told the man in charge and said, this is your student, teach her for one day. And at the end of the day, I went back and said, so how is your student? The sister, and he said, she does very well, Father. If she gets out of the convent, she has her job here. Accept that. In short, I think this is what we mean by the poor as theologians. That I think the poor, St. Vincent said that, has a lot to teach us. And I think we have to operationalize it in our own theological learning process. We call the motto of our school as doing theology from the margins. It's that. So it's not just me, it's also the other professors who are doing that in their different ways and different contexts.
In the back, do we have a question?
Hi, my name is Lana Popo. I'm a junior at DePaul. I'm also the co-president of Student Against Incarceration. Besides that, my question for you, sir, is like, my mom is from Ghana, and of course they have Roman Catholicism over there. But my question to you is like, in America, I feel like, of course, it's a very different way of life than in the Philippines. When we do see people who are in lower social economics, I feel like maybe it's harder for people within the Catholic faith to like step outside of their box to help people who are in those lower socioeconomics, because there is a big margin within the Catholic faith, whether it be the people of color, the economic status that people are coming from. Like, you know, there's just a lot of, it's very white and it's very like, you know, in a small box. So how can people within that box step out of that box so it doesn't come off as like a white saviorism or like, you know, God complex? Because I feel like that's what pushes people away from the faith. You see a lot of people like convert to other religions because it's very open, but a lot of people are not converting to Catholicism because they feel like they're going to be trapped in a box. So with your experience, like what are some like things you would give to us so that when we are going to these communities, we can like place ourselves from like, you get what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
Thank you.
Two things. Pope Francis talks about two kinds of peripheries. Geographical periphery, which is like a poor area or garbage dump, etc. Or an existential periphery. Existential periphery doesn't have to be far. It could be the next person who experiences loneliness, exclusion, pain. And you don't have to go far, Philippines or Ghana for that matter. I think peripheries are all over the place. And if we care about the peripheries, it is precisely where Vincent God is calling us. Second, I think the main point that you're saying, how do we go there in a way that does not make us saviors, redeemers, or say whatever. Like, I think the point is we go there in order to listen. Central to synodality is listening. Listening to the other different from you. Listening to another's pain. Even without a solution. To be able to be listened to is a solution in itself. And we will not be saviors. Ironically, it is the other who's saving us. This is my personal experience. And some people ask me, so you teach from Monday to Friday, and when is your day off? I told myself, Sunday is my day off. Because that Sunday with them, in fact, influences how I do theology. It enlivens how I teach. It gives meaning to the text that I read. In short, I thought before I was invited to the garbage dump to help my confer, celebrate mass, and help the people. And people say, we need you, Father, here. But thinking through it, I feel that it is them who is actually helping me. I am not the savior. They saved me.
Father, thank you. Thank you for sharing your vulnerability, your experience, your wisdom. I appreciate it very much. Oh, sorry. I said thank you. As a woman of deep faith, who is a mother of 3 young people, who works with young people daily, I attempt to live my mission, my faith. But I see more and more how the young people around me, including the ones in my household who pray before they sleep, and they do things with me because it is our family tradition as much as it is our faith, right? But they've, except for one of them who will die Catholic, the other 2 have not stayed with our active in our faith in the ritualistic way. I see young people struggling so much to find relevance, not just in our faith, but in any faith, organized religion. And I feel like what you shared, or the way that you shared what you shared, might be part of the seed, part of the key to relevance, to connection. I'm also painfully aware that more and more in my experience, I find young people not as adept at dialogue and encounter as young people perhaps 8 years ago, 10 years ago. We're in a world where our leaders are good at throwing Molotov cocktails and running away without engaging. Do you have any ideas about how we teach each other to listen, how we teach each other to engage, be in dialogue? In dialogue, transformation happens. How do we bring those skills back?
Yeah. It's a difficult question to answer because I come from a different social location and different place. But let me tell you a story. I have been also invited by German churches to speak about the church in the Philippines and what we do there. And some of my audiences are high school students in Germany who are not concerned with the religion at all. They are just there because they have to, or I don't know, part of the class. And it's a little bit intimidating for a person from the third world to talk to young men and women with all these rings inside here and yellow here and black here or something like that. It's a different world.
Yeah.
But you know what? I just tell my story. And this is what I do in the parish in the Philippines. I show some video. This is what the youth are doing. And this is how they find meaning in their lives. And this is what they think, how to live as humans. And when I tell the stories, all these young people who couldn't care less are all eyes and ears. In one of those classrooms, after I left, they met, and by themselves, without the prodding of their teacher, said, can we contribute to the children of the Philippines? So when I went to another school, the teacher called me. My class decided to like contribute something from their whatever as allowances, and this they would like you to bring to the kids that you shared about. I think witness, experience, and sharing of it is the key. I think young people believe in witnesses, not ideas. Life, I think. And then theology, whatever it is, all these inventions of theologians, theology would come alive without your explaining it. I don't know, that's an experience.
Thank you.
And I wonder, I mean, here we have young people right here, right now, who can speak. We don't have to wonder, right? What are there any thoughts that you want to share, or what your longings are for the church?
Well, I had a question. It kind of goes along with what you were saying. And thank you, Georgie, for saying that. I think it's very valuable. My question to you is, do you see, as someone who is very close to their faith, and I've also had periods in my life where I still went to church, but I was like, I'm just there. Like, I'm just going for tradition because my parents were telling me to. And then it wasn't until I chose to practice my own faith, and it was like my own choice, that like my faith grew. And I feel like a lot of people are like, I want to say not scared, but like they don't agree with a lot of things in the Catholic Church, like institution wise and traditional Catholic values. Do you think that with the synod process, like that will hopefully cause change in the church so that more people or like youth would be inclined to converting to Catholicism and exploring their faith? Because I feel that like a lot of people are not wanting to be practicing Catholics because like the core Catholic values don't align with theirs in modern times. And I feel like, do you also believe that the church should progress as times pass as well?
Thank you.
That was a loaded question. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's quite difficult. You're like defending a thesis in front of 30 panels. but I think, again, these are two different contexts. And I don't like to speak from the perspective of your context because I don't know it. But in the Philippines, in our practice among the youth, actually religion or Catholic affiliation is not the first thing. You just invite them. And if they feel like coming, whoever they are, they come. For instance, the victims of the drugs of war, these women, there are 100 victims in the Payatas parish alone. And we have like 40, 45 women and children. Not all of them are Catholics. We gather because they're victims. And we don't even ask, what's your Catholic affiliation? If you feel like coming and you think the activities are meaningful, trauma healing, etc., please come. You're free. I think this is connected with dwindling numbers, which was a question in an earlier. Let me go back to Pope Francis. If we are concerned with our numbers, then that's self-referentiality. But if we just do helping, mission, whatever helps, I think people would come as they want and as they feel. And that would be better for us. So one time, these mothers, they're not all Catholic. Some are evangelicals, there's no Muslim. I was thinking there was one. But because we're Catholic tradition, we all bring them to a retreat. So we all went to a retreat, and I think a good number, like 10, has no experience of confession, but because we are Catholic tradition, I opened myself to, so this time is time for confession. And these evangelicals went for confession. And they said, Father, can I confess? Sure. I said, I do not know. I am a born again Christian. Do you really want? You're not forced to. No, no, I want. So, you know, people, without your saying it, people will come if they find it meaningful. That's our experience. And I think to be an open church, whatever the affiliation is what synodality is all about. To be honest about it, it's not about Catholics. It's about God giving good news to his people.
Another question? Oh yeah, like response. I get what you're saying, Father. To your point, I feel like, and I was talking to my peer about this, like, I feel like the issue is that, and I consider myself a theologian because I like to read, and I read a lot of books, and a lot of people my age don't like to read, like religious texts, but I like taking the classes at DePaul, taking all kinds of intersectional, different faiths and comparing the two. But I feel like, to your point, when I got baptized when I was like 17, and my father was like, "Oh, you're a tall one," because 8-year-olds are like this small. But I feel like the reason why I came is because my area was like a Hispanic and Filipino area, and like, no offense to the traditional Caucasian masses, but like it was so lively in that environment because they embedded it with their culture, like with the Filipino masses, like they'll speak Tagalog and like we'll eat like all the Filipino food after good food, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, like it was like it felt more of a community, and so I see what you're saying, but I would say like to the people here who are within the Catholic faith and like work, how can you challenge them to make their parish more accepting? Because I feel like we're so strict on like we're saying like when you come and you're new and you don't like I remember my first time in mass, everyone's going like this. I was like, huh? Like what? It's so strict. Like it's like point A, point B. Like you gotta say this and that and that. So like, how can we like make it more inclusive for people who don't know like the steps, who don't know like the orders and the steps, to feel like they belong? That's my question. Thank you.
I think it's a question for the people here, right? but you're right. Sometimes the church is too strict. Well, even in the Philippines, people has that impression. Father, it's not only that the homilies are long and it can bring you to sleep, but it's just too strict. It's the people saying that, even in the context of the Philippines. I think we need to loosen up. There's just too much rules in the church that drives people away. Am I saying something heretical? Anyway.
There's actually a question from the Zoom that maybe relates. It was, do you believe it's the judgment of some Catholics against others that causes people often to leave more than the quote traditions of the church?
That's also true, because we have been always trained that we have the truth, that we know the truth, and that whatever is said to us is the truth. The rest are less than the truth. So with that very, how do you call that? Arrogant thinking, which is present in all theologies, in most theologies. This is it that drives people away. So if you know the truth, good luck. I'm going somewhere else. I think that's the point.
We have
maybe one last one, about time.
Just to pick up on what the student said, I remember a student saying to me not long ago, I just can't relate to Christ as king. And we talked about that, and it fits in with the whole Christology that we're talking about and the ecclesiology that we've been talking about today. I can't relate to Christ as king. That's why when you began by saying, you know, Pope Francis, the idea that God is mercy, that's a fundamentally different idea than God is king. Not that kings can't be merciful. King Louis was the only king that I know that got sainted. And you know, that's part of the problem. It's also the imagery that's very, very difficult. I also had another student that said, I have a real problem relating to God as Father. And part of the problem was because of the home environment that they had to live with and the abuse and so forth. So we've got to rethink those things, especially from a theological standpoint, or else they don't make sense to a lot of people.
Thank you. So actually, church reform is not just structures. It's structures of the mind. And that includes theology and how we have been trained theologically for thousands or hundreds of years. That is a long revolution. Some people are afraid of reform. I think we need revolution. And that revolution is longer than what you think.
Again, Father Pilario, we've come to the end of our time together. It looks like from the schedule, this is it for the day. And that folks will be reconvening breakfast at 9, 10 a.m. roundtable, the transformation of society. And I think that's here. Yes, it's all here. Thank you. Thanks to those who've been with us virtually and all of you, and have a blessed weekend.